There was once a king whose kingdom was plagued by a dragon. The king did not know which way to turn. The king's knights were all cowards who hid under their beds whenever the dragon came in sight, so they were of no use to the king at all. And the king's wizard could not help either because, being old, he had forgotten his magic spells. Nor could the wizard look up the spells that had slipped his mind, for he had unfortunately misplaced his wizard's book many years before. The king was at his wits' end. Every time there was a full moon, the dragon came out of his lair and ravaged the countryside. He frightened maidens and stopped up chimneys and broke store windows and set people's clocks back and made dogs bark until no one could hear himself think. He tipped over fences and robbed graves and put frogs in people's drinking water and tore the last chapters out of novels and changed house numbers around so that people crawled into bed with their neighbors. He stole spark plugs out of people's cars and put firecrackers in people's cigars and stole the clappers from all the church bells and sprung every bear trap for miles around so the bears could wander wherever they pleased. And to top it all off, he changed around all the roads in the kingdom so that people could not get anywhere except by starting out in the wrong direction. "That," said the king in a fury, "is enough!" And he called a meeting of everyone in the kingdom. Now it happened that there lived in the kingdom a wise old cobbler who had a wife and 3 sons. The cobbler and his family came to the king's meeting and stood way in the back by the door, for the cobbler had a feeling that since he was nobody important, there had probably been a mistake, and no doubt the king had intended the meeting for everyone in the kingdom except his family and him. "Ladies and gentlemen," said the king when everyone was present, "I put up with that dragon as long as I can. He has got to be stopped." All the people whispered amongst themselves, and the king smiled, pleased with the impression he had made. But the wise cobbler said gloomily, "It's all very well and good to talk about it, but how are you going to do it?" And now all the people smiled and winked as if to say, "Well, he's got you there." The king frowned. "It's not that His Majesty hasn't tried," the queen spoke loyally. "Yes," said the king, "I've told my knights again and again that they ought to slay that dragon, but I can't force them to go. I'm not a tyrant." "Why doesn't the wizard say a magic spell?" asked the cobbler. "He's done the best he can," said the king. The wizard blushed, and everyone looked embarrassed. "I used to do all sorts of spells and chants when I was younger," the wizard explained, "but I've lost my spell book, and I begin to fear I'm losing my memory too. For instance, I've been trying for days now to recall one spell I used to do. I forget just now what the deuce it was for. It went something like bimble wimble cha-cha-choomph. Suddenly, to everyone's surprise, the queen turned into a rosebush. "Oh dear," said the wizard. "Now you've done it," groaned the king. "Poor mother," said the princess. "I don't know what can have happened," the wizard said nervously, "but don't worry. I'll have her changed back in a jiffy." He shut his eyes and racked his brain for a spell that would change her back. But the king said quickly, "You'd better leave well enough alone. If you change her into a rattlesnake, we'll have to chop off her head." Meanwhile, the cobbler stood with his hands in his pockets, sighing at the waste of time. "About the dragon," he began. "Oh, yes," said the king. "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give the princess's hand in marriage to anyone who can make the dragon stop." "It's not enough," said the cobbler. "She's a nice enough girl, you understand. But how would an ordinary person support her? Also, what about those of us that are already married?" "In that case," said the king, "I'll offer the princess's hand or half the kingdom or both, whichever is most convenient." The cobbler scratched his chin and considered it. "It's not enough," he said at last. "It's a good enough kingdom, you understand, but it's too much responsibility." "Take it or leave it," said the king. "I'll leave it," said the cobbler. And he shrugged and went home. But the cobbler's eldest son thought the bargain was a good one, for the princess was very beautiful, and he liked the idea of having half the kingdom to run as he pleased. So he said to the king, "I'll accept those terms, your majesty. By tomorrow morning, the dragon will be slain." "Bless you!" cried the king. "Hooray! Hooray! Hooray!" cried all the people, throwing their hats in the air. The cobbler's eldest son beamed with pride, and the second eldest son looked at him enviously. The youngest son said timidly, "Excuse me, your majesty, but don't you think the queen looks a little unwell? If I were you, I think I'd water her." "Good heavens!" cried the king, glancing at the queen, who had been changed into a rosebush. "I'm glad you mentioned it." Now the cobbler's eldest son was very clever, and was known far and wide for how quickly he could multiply fractions in his head. He was perfectly sure he could slay the dragon by somehow or other playing a trick on him, and he didn't feel that he needed his wise old father's advice, but he thought it was only polite to ask. So he went to his father, who was working as usual at his cobbler's bench, and said, "Well, father, I'm off to slay the dragon. Have you any advice to give me?" The cobbler thought a moment and replied, "When and if you come to the dragon's lair, recite the following poem. Dragon, dragon, how do you do? I've come from the king to murder you. Say it very loudly and firmly, and the dragon will fall, God willing, at your feet." "How curious," said the elder son. And he thought to himself, "The old man is not as wise as I thought. If I say something like that to the dragon, he will eat me up in an instant. The way to kill a dragon is to outfox him." And keeping his opinion to himself, the eldest son set forth on his quest. When he came at last to the dragon's lair, which was a cave, the eldest son slyly disguised himself as a peddler and knocked on the door and called out, "Hello there!" "There's nobody at home!" roared a voice. The voice was as loud as an earthquake, and the eldest son's knees knocked together in terror. "I don't come to trouble you," the eldest son said meekly. "I merely thought you might be interested in looking at some of our brushes. Or if you prefer," he added quickly, "I could leave our catalog with you, and I could drop by again, say, early next week." "I don't want any brushes," the voice roared, "and I especially don't want any next week." "Oh," said the eldest son. But now his knees were knocking together so badly that he had to sit down. Suddenly, a great shadow fell over him, and the eldest son looked up. It was the dragon. The eldest son drew his sword, but the dragon lunged and swallowed him in a single gulp, sword and all, and the eldest son found himself in the dark of the dragon's belly. "What a fool I was not to listen to my wise old father," thought the eldest son, and he began to weep bitterly.